Alors maintenant, j'aimerais inviter notre prochaine conférencière, Deborah Windell, qui est du Prevention and Early Intervention Program for Psychosis, London, Ontario.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be here. I am from the PEP program in London, and when I first started there, Dr. Mallow was the director of the program, and I was sad to see him go, as many people were, and did what I could do to follow him as much as I could without coming to Montreal, and I continued working with him on my master's thesis here at McGill, and that's the research I'll be presenting the findings of that research to you this afternoon. It was a wonderful experience, and I would also like to say congratulations for the 10 years and all that you and your team have accomplished here in that time. So this presentation is to provide the findings of a study that we did that took a little bit of a different approach to exploring recovery from early psychosis, in that it is from a qualitative perspective, so speaking to individuals about their experience of the illness and specifically about their experience of recovery and treatment. And at this time, there really is, and there still is, not a lot known about the personal experiences of people who've gone through first episode psychosis. There is more research on recovery for people with maybe more long-standing illnesses, but at this point in time, there's still a lot lacking in this area. But it is a really important time to talk to people about what their experiences of recovery are like, because as we know, these are when really critical changes happen, and we do need to know more about them. What changes promote positive outcome, what changes can prevent chronicity, and also we would also like to know what the experiences of people who receive specialized intervention. What is their experience of treatment? What did they find helpful? What did they not find helpful? And of course, the goal of all of this is to try to improve services as much as possible so that people get service that not only improves their outcome clinically, but also provides them with service that is personally meaningful to them and their recovery. So the purpose of this particular study was to explore both the commonalities and variations of personal meaning of recovery, as well as the early recovery experiences for those individuals who received early intervention care in London, Ontario for their first episode of psychosis. And our main research questions were, what does recovery mean to individuals? What's the recovery experience following a first episode of psychosis? And also, what is early intervention treatment like for individuals? So it's a fairly large sample. We interviewed 30 individuals that were in early recovery from a first episode in London. They were individuals who were already participating in a study on long-term outcome that was using a lot of clinical measures. And so we added this component to the study where we talked about the lived experience. And participants were still in early recovery, but had completed 2 years in the program and were generally at 3, 4, or 5 years post-onset. So it's still early, but provide them a bit of time to be able to reflect back on their experiences over their recovery. We developed a semi-structured interview where we asked them about their experience of recovery and treatment. The goal, of course, was to get an in-depth account of how they make sense of their own experience. And just quickly, the demographics of the sample for this study were very similar to the population that we treat at PEP, about 3/4% male. The age mean was about 26, which if you consider that their onset of treatment was 3 to 5 years before that, of course makes sense. And the diagnostic breakdown is pretty similar. Just to put into context their clinical course, the vast majority had remitted from their first episode of psychosis from a clinical point of view. 40% had never relapsed after their first episode of psychosis, so conversely 47% did. Participants had on average 1 relapse, ranging from no relapses to up to 5 relapses, and on average had 2 hospitalizations over the course of their treatment so far. The analytic framework that we used was interpretive phenomenological analysis, which is a qualitative phenomenological approach that looks at subjective experience, specifically, of course, for the meaning of recovery. We asked individuals to reflect on what recovery meant to them, what turning points they identified as important in their recovery, and this is what we found. So in general, we found that 3 domains of recovery were identified by people, 3 main domains, and that within these there were 7 common early recovery processes that fell within them, and that the vast majority of people identified at least one of these areas as important in their recovery. Most people identified at least 2 areas, and I think it was almost a quarter of people identified at least one process from each of these 3 areas was important to their recovery. So clearly their recovery was multidimensional in nature. So illness recovery, I'll get into what these mean in a moment, was the most dominant domain of recovery, 80% of people, followed by psychological and personal recovery. 67% of participants identified processes in that area, and then social and functional recovery, where also well over half of individuals identified as important in their recovery. So illness recovery, just really briefly, is what we would consider to be, I suppose, clinical recovery. So it's specifically people identified an alleviation of their psychiatric symptoms as important in their recovery. Well over 3/4 of individuals identified that as important, often described it as the point at which they could then move forward in their recovery in other areas, although not exclusively. And over half of individuals identified specific turning points in the recovery that related to their symptoms. And it's important probably to note that these turning points often varied greatly from a week or 2 after starting treatment all the way up to 3, 4, or 5 years later. So there was important turning points that came well after the 2-year period. And I'll just read a couple quotations to you to illustrate. So one young man said, "I look back at myself and go, I was thinking that, but that's not true. At the time, it felt like it was true or it sounded good to me, but it wasn't a real thought. And it wasn't until I could actually say, no, that's not true, that I reached that turning point." So some people described this elimination of symptoms as quite sudden, that they quickly resolved. For others, it was an incremental process. And this young man describes the more incremental process, saying, "I went to Seroquel, which started to work pretty well. And at that point, I probably would have said that I was recovered. But when I went to clozapine, it was like another level." Moving to the next domain of psychological and personal recovery, this particular category encompassed a variety of different processes, which included developing a meaningful and personalized understanding of what their experience had been, and regaining a sense of control over their lives, and ultimately restoring a coherent sense of self. And about 67% of our participants included one or more of those themes in their recovery. And not always, but often this was also seen as, once these major tensions could be resolved, that then they could move forward in their social recovery. So these things do appear to build on one another, at least for some individuals. And 2 of the main processes that were described in this meaning-making domain was first the recognizing of a psychological problem and then reconciling what that meant to the person. And this was done in very different ways, and I'll get into this a little bit more. But what emerged from the data was that clearly this looking for meaning and explanation, acceptance, was a critical process in early recovery, and one that I emphasize in this talk for that reason. So the first step was, intuitively, of course, it makes sense that to realize something is not right with your psychological experience, that this could be considered insight, of course. So this idea that the person identified something was not right with their self-experience was critical, and then figuring out what to do about it and trying to figure out what it was and what it meant. and that this was an important turning point, and that, of course, at that point then, it was much more likely the person would engage in treatment and help seeking. The next step then would be once you've noticed something is not right, is what does it mean? So the individual would often take some time to try to understand what it is they've been through and come up with some kind of coherent explanation that made sense with what they believed and what they had experienced. For many people, this was reckoning with whether this was an illness or not, if this would be a short-term or a chronic experience for them. And what we noticed was that there was a large variability in the duration and distress associated with that particular process. So generally, explanation seeking, so creating an explanatory model that the person felt comfortable with, was an important quest. People would use ideas that they already had about mental illness to make this assessment, messages they received from others, clinicians, family, and then, of course, what their direct experience was. If that made sense to them, that would be an illness. And often participants talked about the idea of acceptance, which generally meant that this was potentially a long-term illness, that they would be vulnerable to relapse. And of course, people didn't always just start with one explanation, figure it all out, and then be happy and onward their way. People needed to revise their model as their illness unfolded. So someone would explain that they had an explanatory model that this was because they had done drugs, and this is why they had this experience, and now they felt better, and this wasn't going to be a problem anymore. Would then have to, once relapsing, have to revise that model of illness that, well, actually, I wasn't doing drugs that time, so I have to come up with a new explanation. I'm just going to read you this one quote that typifies what that sort of narrative is like. This one fellow said, "After I relapsed, I'm thinking, ever since I took olanzapine, all that went away, after all, just like I did when I took risperidol." And I was like, oh, it's an illness. And that was actually the pinnacle, but it took a while for me to get to realize that. So obviously this was a period of adjustment and not an easy one for many people, because not only did it mean things about their lives, but it meant things about sort of their personal identity and their social identity. And so for some people this involved, they described a lot of painful experiences, a lot of feelings of loss, a lot of feelings of powerlessness. This young woman summarized her experience as, "I had this huge breakdown because I thought here I was living for like 2 years and I thought I knew who I was, but then it's like that idea is not true. So then you have to rebuild who you are all over again." So that, of course, would be a very daunting prospect. So some individuals did struggle to come up with this constructive acceptance of illness. And for those individuals, inevitably, a big turning point for them was when they were able to resolve those tensions, and come to an explanation that they felt comfortable with. This young man said, "I think I was just putting schizophrenia aside, and I wasn't dealing with it. I think the reason why I relapsed was I still hadn't dealt with acceptance. A big part of turning things around for myself was no longer worrying about the stigma." So in addition to making meaning of the experiences, individuals then also had to reckon with the meaning for what they had gone through for their sense of self, which often had taken a toll. What they had gone through had taken a bit of a beating. So at that point then, a lot of individuals described the importance of rebuilding a positive identity, and this included processes of both enhancing their self-concept and also in some cases actually redefining themselves. So people described how important it was to rediscover previous talents, abilities, positive traits, to promote their self-concept and also give them a sense of accomplishment, and also to provide a certain amount of linkage between sort of who they were and who they are now. But also not just learning and reflecting on and enacting things that they were good at before, but a lot of people described how important it was that they had changed in a positive way from their experience. And that was important to a lot of people, and that included things like having a more developed sense of empathy for other people now that they had experienced that kind of suffering. So one woman said, "I feel like I've grown and I feel like a better person. I think before I was just letting life go by and living for the next party. I've grown, I've found a new passion." So moving on quickly to social and functional recovery, this was also a domain that was identified by a great many people as very important in their recovery. It included themes like learning how to be able to talk to people again, going back to school, having a job, having friends, having a partner. The two main themes were resuming roles and engaging or repairing relationships. It was a very common turning point in recovery for many people, going back to a role or starting a role, actually. It didn't always have to be a resumption of a role. And a lot of people talked with quite a bit of passion about how important it was for them to go back to their post-secondary studies, and that provided them with a sense of continuity, that they were still the same person with the same goals and still capable of the same things. So that was a striking theme that came through in the narratives. So basically at its essence, social recovery is getting a positive social identity and having social inclusion again. So this fellow said, I know if recovery's occurred for myself when I do get a job and I keep that job, and I do make new friends and I get into a relationship. So once those things start happening and I'm able to keep those things in my life, then I'll know recovery has happened. I'm just going to skip those for time. So relationship repair was also very important to people. Relationships were extremely important in recovery. Relationships of all kinds, peers, family members, co-workers, teachers, romantic partners, and very much service providers. But in great detail, people talked about peer relationships as critical, and that's probably not surprising given the developmental stage of our folks, and also what that provided for them in terms of making meaning of their experience and figuring out who they now were going to be.